Welcome, everybody, to Destination Unknown, episode number 24. Bradford Murrow has sent me over to talk about Edgar Allan Poe with the wonderful Richard Kopley. Richard, welcome, and thank you for coming on in today.
Thank you, Max. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
I know that you have a new book coming out, Edgar Allan Poe, A Life, University of Virginia Press, I believe.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. What can you tell us new about Poe that he's been written about so extensively? What do we have new?
Well, we have stories about Poe, particularly in Richmond,
Hmm.
friends and family, stories that we haven't known before.
Beautiful.
New stories that show Poe very much a social person, very much with people, and very much beloved by these people.
And a little bit different than what our take is of him prior to this.
Right.
Right.
He's not a disembodied mind floating through the universe. He's a person. He's an unusual person, but he's a person with other people who really care about him.
And what made him before we get into the new part of what's going on with Edgar Allan Poe, what made him so unusual? Was it his vision of life?
Well, partly it was his native genius,
Mhm.
and partly it was the considerable struggle he endured as a boy and as an adolescent that threw him on his own resources in ways that perhaps he might not otherwise have been had
Right.
his father not abandoned the family, had his mother not died, had he grown up more loved and less challenged. Um, so I think the two together, his sense of his own remarkable mind and his difficulty in his early years, and in fact throughout his life, combined to lead to an effort to be great.
Right. So early on, he had a vision of wanting to be a great writer.
He
He
did.
he strived for that.
Yes, yes, he certainly did. He
Mhm.
in when he was only 10 years old, so this would have been 1820. Um, he'd been writing poems about the schoolgirls of Richmond. He had just returned from England,
Mhm.
um, and he was reacquainting himself with his old friends and making new friends. And he would write poems about these girls his own age, and um, wanted to put them in a book. And he asked his foster father, John Allen, and John Allen actually went to his teacher, whose name was Clark, and asked if these poems could be put together in a book. And the teacher said, "Don't do it. He already has, he already thinks very well of himself, and if he be published, it would be very difficult because he would be so satisfied and proud and perhaps perhaps a little overbearing. I don't know, but the poems were not published, and
Right.
largely they were lost.
Not even in a school's literary magazine back in
No,
the 1800s.
it was the girls were from largely from a girls' school, and I
Mhm.
think the teachers would not have approved. So
Yeah.
no, they were not published there. But in any case, my point is, yes, as early as 10 years old, he clearly wanted to be and thought he would be a great writer.
And you have dug so richly into his life. Where does that, as such an early age, we know he's a literary genius, but where does that stem from of having that scope of vision? I mean, at 10 years old.
Well, uh, he was in England between 1815 and 1820. So he certainly would have heard about some of the great writers.
Right.
I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Byron. You know, he would have known in perhaps a way that an American child at that time wouldn't yet have known of the possibility of even in this day and time of being a great writer of genius and tremendous accolade. And perhaps he brought that idea back with him. Certainly, he would have known it from his reading, but he might
Right.
even have known it from his his just experience of being a kid in London, that this was a possibility for a person.
Not to mention, of course, he had an idea of who Shakespeare was,
Well,
with,
of course,
yeah,
sure.
geographically where he was. So he may have been implanted early on with great literary genius and visions of that.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he he was gifted in particularly in literary ways, and he could see it. He knew it. People told him so, although every so often they differed. But generally, he knew he had something,
Mhm.
and he wanted to prove to people what he knew innately. And when the book was not published in 1820 or 1820, he lost that chance. But uh, in 1827, when he was in Boston and Tamerlane was published, finally, he could begin to prove himself.
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit about that journey in 1827 and how that publication came to be? Because we know it wasn't easy, but I know you have uncovered, the man and his being back then. What was he going through?
He had been a terrific student in school in Richmond and was going to go to the University of Virginia. And he did go, but his foster father was becoming alienated from him, perhaps because Poe had this sense of himself as a genius, perhaps because Poe was not a money-oriented person, a thrifty business fellow like the foster father was. There was an antagonism between them, and John Allen simply did not give him the money he needed to be a college student. He had very little provided to him, and Poe was a great student, but at the same time, he was beginning to drink. And to
Right.
make up for the money that was not present, he was gambling. And he lost a lot of money.
What was he gambling on in the 1820s? What was the gamble?
Card games,
Card
card
games.
games,
Okay.
yeah. And if you look at the history of the University of Virginia, this was common. Gambling,
Mm.
drinking in the first few years, it was actually a pretty rowdy place. Poe wasn't rowdy, but the gambling and the drinking, he was partaking in both and lost a lot of money, perhaps as much as $2,000, $2,500 in their money. Today,
Okay.
what would it be? 60, 70,000. It's a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
And John Allen pulled him out. And Poe was, uh, roundly chastised, and his reputation among his friends in Richmond suffered. It was a kind of a time of shame. And the difficulty between foster father and foster son just grew. And, my sense is that John Allen would not only uh, chastise Edgar, but according to a letter he wrote to Edgar's brother, he would implicitly chastise Edgar's mother, whose third child was suspected to be by a man not her husband. So he had to suffer not only the abuse of himself, but the abuse of the mother he loved. Finally, he just couldn't take it anymore. And he wrote a letter to John Allen saying, "You will not be surprised to know that I'm leaving." And the letter is written along the lines of the Declaration of Independence, reason after reason after reason why this treatment that he has received
Right.
is intolerable and he has to leave. And he does leave. So that's the point at which, to come back to your question, he
Yeah.
goes to Boston. Why Boston?
That
Perhaps,
was my next question.
yeah, perhaps because his mother had given him a picture that she'd done and written on the back of the picture, "For Edgar, who should ever love Boston, where his mother found her best friends." So he was born in Boston, but that wouldn't have been enough. I think it was that he had this association of his mother's happiness with Boston
Sure.
because of this picture, and traveled there by by vessel, and had a very, very, very difficult time. And in fact, had to join the army. He just had no resources. He had to make a living, and so he did join the army. But the great fortune was he met a young publisher who was willing to take a chance on this book of poems by this unknown fellow, and that was Tamerlane. And Tamerlane was no great hit, but there are elements of it that are recognizable as truly gifted writing that anticipate what is to come.
And I just want to go back to the Boston idea here. He was born in Boston. What city exactly was he born in?
Well, he was born in what we think of as downtown
Okay,
Boston.
downtown Boston. So
Yeah.
do you think that geographically and maybe even spiritually he felt like he had roots there, and not only with his mother's happiness of her friends and maybe her youth, but maybe going back home was a good thing for a reverse of what he was going through?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, when he published Tamerlane anonymously, it said only by a Bostonian. I think he was trying to make himself a new home.
Sure.
And incidentally, in 2014, a statue was put up in Boston of Edgar Allan Poe returning to his home. So what he anticipated perhaps took a little too long, but it eventually happened.
Where is that statue now? Is it
It's across from the Common,
okay?
um, and it's right on Charles Street, which cuts the Common from separates the Common from the Boston Public Garden.
And for those who are going to watch this that may not know what Boston Common is, it's the city park in the middle of Boston.
That's right. That's right. And by the way, this statue of Poe is not on a pedestal. It's right there on the sidewalk.
Okay.
You could go up to him and take a selfie. I mean, he's right there
I'm sure they're doing it all the time.
all the time, all the time.
So 2014 that was erected. That's funny. All those years. And so did he consider himself a New Englander? I mean,
Well, he may have wanted to early on, but there was he had a very difficult time,
mhm,
and he didn't consider himself a New Englander. Finally, had to give up on that possibility, and in fact, he considered himself a Virginian, and
okay.
specifically, he considered himself a Richmonder.
Mhm,
Um, that was his home base. Um, so, he grew up in Richmond, but he also came back to Richmond in 48 and 49.
mhm.
And, much as I love Boston and Poe's connection to Boston, I have to admit, Richmond was his home.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you have traveled the paper trail here, which brings us to the book that University of Virginia is putting. When is the book coming out?
March 18th, about
March
6.
18th. Okay, so we will definitely release this right at that time for you.
Thank you.
What have you uncovered? Because I know you've written about Poe before,
Right.
and so what new light are you going to shed on Mr. Poe for everybody?
Well, um, there'll be a lot. The book is over 700 pages. Some of it has to do with the work I had been doing on Poe before.
Mhm.
Some of it has to do with new research I did as I was working on the book, but some of it comes from a collection of letters I bought in 1992, and
Okay.
not having time really to go through them, I just put them aside and came back to them in 2012 and realized I had something remarkable. I had a series of letters about Poe
Right.
that nobody had seen.
Well,
They were
okay. We gotta pause and highlight this.
uh,
1992. What auction house are these letters in? Was it an auction house?
no, it was a private person.
Private person is selling you Poe letters.
She does not know, I don't think. She has a box, a cardboard box about this big.
This is going to be a great story already. I can already tell you are starting to glow now.
Yes, well, it's an amazing story.
Yeah.
So I I ask her, I'm told it has to do with Poe. So I ask her, well, what is it exactly? I'm on the phone with her. And she says, well, paper stuff. So I'm really not getting anywhere. So, and I believe she didn't actually know. I believe
Right.
she was cleaning out a room in her house and she
Mhm.
wanted to just move this on. And she didn't have the time to study it. So I thought, well, how much is the most I could offer her that's enough so that she'll sell it to me, but not so much that I'll be crushed if it turns out to be of no significance. Now, this sounds comical today,
Well,
but
1992,
in
sure. I mean, of
1992,
course.
in
Yeah.
1992, I offered her $200.
Okay. I mean, it's not like you could get on the phone and go on a Zoom call or a FaceTime call. I mean, it's a different world.
It's a
So
different
you're
world.
only
So
talking to her voice to voice.
that's it. And she accepted, and I sent her a check, and she sent me the box. And I looked through the box. The top half of the box was clippings from turn of the 19th century, that is to say, turn of the 20th century magazines.
Okay.
And they're interesting, but they're not unique. But the bottom half of the box was manuscript material from I don't know who to I don't know who. And the handwriting is extremely difficult. Uh, I see Poe's name every so often, but it's going to be a huge amount of work. I don't have the time. I'm teaching, I'm doing research, I'm doing administration. And so I just put the box aside.
Okay, hold on. You said that you see Poe's name. So what you're really seeing is the name Edgar, or is there another name he's being called?
No, no, it's Edgar.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right. It's Edgar.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's Poe.
Yeah.
I know he's in there. I don't know what
Right. The extent. Sure.
significant, but I, j- I can't do this. I can't let go of all these other things I'm doing. I'm in the middle of my academic career. So I just say, I'll get to this
When you
some,
get to it. Yeah.
yeah. So 20 years later, I happened to look in that spot and I said, oh my God, that's the box.
So you actually forgot all about.
I think if you would have asked me, I would have
Right.
remembered,
Sure.
but I just
Sure.
wasn't thinking of it
Right.
anymore.
Right.
So I see it, I take it out, and I say, okay, so as not to be too overwhelmed by this, take out one letter. Don't think of the fact that there are pages and pages
Right.
and
Make,
pages.
make it digestible. Make it
Yeah,
digestible.
take
Sure.
one.
Yeah.
So I sit at my computer, my laptop, and I'm looking at this letter. And initially, it's extremely hard to read the handwriting. As I go, of course, I begin to get used to it, but I'm working it through. I don't know who's writing or to whom, but I read a story about Edgar. And it's Edgar as a 3-year-old.
Mhm.
Now, the key here is he had a friend. The friend was named John H. Mackenzie. And John H. Mackenzie is the through line through these letters.
Okay.
Why? Because the author of the letters was John H. Mackenzie's stepdaughter. And before her mother married him, her mother was the cousin of his wife. So the writer, actually knew John H. Mackenzie, Poe's best friend, her whole life. That what
And the, the home of which you bought these letters from, whose home was that?
that was a descendant of the correspondent. I'll give you some names so it won't
Yeah.
all be pronouns. The woman who wrote the letters was named Flora,
Okay.
Flora Lapham Mack. She
Beautiful.
was writing to a distant relative whose name was William Lanier Washington. He died, the letters went to his wife. She died, the letters descended in the family. I bought them from a descendant. So Flora is in touch with this distant relative who says he's going to write a biography of Poe. Would she give him her material? So
Okay.
she agrees. And it turns out, I later learned, that this fellow did write a biography of Poe, didn't think it was very good, and destroyed it. So it doesn't exist. But
What was this, a book or an article?
it would have been a manuscript book.
Okay, would have been a book. Okay,
Yeah. But he protected the letters.
sure.
So, and these letters are particularly important because they focus on Richmond. Now, there was a lot of material about Poe in Richmond among his friends in Richmond. And John's brother, whose name was Tom, decided he was going to write a biography. So he asked all the friends in Richmond to give him their stuff, first
Mm,
editions, inscribed,
yeah.
manuscript letters, whatever they had, which they did. So he had this amazing collection of Poe material, and he wrote his biography. It was all in an office in downtown Richmond. In April 1865, when they were threatened by the Union Army, the leaders of Richmond set fire to the city, and 54 square blocks were destroyed. And all these papers were gone.
Void in the fire.
They were just burned. So the stories that my letters tell are otherwise unavailable. They don't exist in the world.
How easily these letters, this box of paper, as she called it, could have just been sent to the curb
Oh, absolutely.
for 100 years.
That's right. And it's not just that they continue to exist, but that the time that it took to study them, I took. And so I could, so for instance, to return to where we were, I'm looking at this first letter, and there's John H. Mackenzie. He's 5 years old.
Mm-hmm.
He just got a new bed. He's jumping up and down on this bed. His parents are going to the theater. His great treat would be for his mother to come in and kiss him goodnight, where she's dressed in all her fine clothing for the theater. And she's about to come in when she hears something and she goes in. He jumped, he fell off the bed, he broke his arm. So she's crying and the father's crying, and they get in touch with their cousins that say, here, take our tickets. We can't go to the theater. We got to attend to our son. And I'm sure they bring in the doctor and he sets the arm and so forth and so on. Very, very painful break. So while they're nursing John that night, the cousins come running back. They say, Aunt, the theater has burned. Everybody's dead. This was the Great Richmond Theater Fire of December 26, 1811. One of the first national catastrophes that that we were aware of as a country. Tremendous, tremendous devastation. That is, I think, something like 74 people were killed, many, many others were injured, and the city was a wreck because everybody knew.
Well, yeah, books have been written just about this fire.
That's
Sure.
right.
Yeah.
So the parents are up all night tending to the boy, wondering which of our friends has died. And of course, they would soon learn that some very close friends had died. And in fact, they might have died had they gone to the theater.
Yeah.
And Edgar Allan Poe's parents might have died had they not been out of town. But anyway, what was decided was that the site of the theater would become a church called a monumental church, which still exists.
Mhm.
So anyway, John is impatient because he's all alone, and some little girl comes to visit him, and he's standing on the steps, and he leans down to kiss her, and he falls again, and he breaks his arm again. And the parents are just, what can we do? They take him upstairs, they call the doctor, and so they give him very strict guideline. You cannot have your friends of your age and your size over. It's just too dangerous. You have to just be here. And they don't want to make him
Right.
solitary for the whole time of recovery. They say, well, there is this little boy. You can play with this little boy who lives nearby.
Here we go. Yeah.
Yes, here we go. So that little boy's name was Edgar. And he already had a connection with the household because John's parents were bringing up Edgar's sister, Rosalie. So Edgar would go and he would visit, but it was John he really wanted to talk to. John was exciting. John was 5 when Edgar was 2. John was 6 when Edgar was 3, a big boy to Edgar. And John says to him, let's have a contest. Okay. Let's see who can tell the best fairy tale.
Oh, okay.
All right. So John starts to tell a fairy tale.
Yeah.
We don't know which fairy tale he told, but he told a fairy tale.
The seed is born.
Yeah, and of course John thinks he's going to win
Yeah.
because he's a bigger boy than this little boy. And Edgar turns to him and tells him so much better a fairy tale. John is just amazed. So John thinks, wait a second, I can do better. So John winds up and tells him the most spectacular fairy tale he could come up with. And Edgar, and then he outdoes him by leaps and bounds. And that's the beginning of the friendship. John realizes this kid is somebody, this kid is something. And we can think of 2 things. We can think, first of all, of Poe's natural gift, his imagination, but also he was a kid who traveled with his mother, who was an actress. And so he would have had the experience of this play and that play, and this plot and that plot. So he might have known more than the average kid of that time of a series of plots,
Sure.
some of which were fairy tales.
And being behind the scenes and seeing the dichotomy of what's behind the scenes and then what goes on in front of the curtain.
Exactly.
Interesting, yeah.
So at that time, uh, they continued to have this contest, and eventually John is healed, and now they're walking around the neighborhood, but they're competing with each other, telling fairy tales throughout. And during this time, John becomes tremendously devoted to Edgar, and Edgar to John, and Edgar begins to confide in John the problems in his life. And he does have problems. He just lost his mother. He just lost his father. He's staying with these people who, it's not so clear that this is going to work out. Really, Edgar wished he was with John's parents, not with the Allens. And the arc of the book, or I suppose one of the arcs of the book, is from this incredible devotion between these 2 boys throughout the life of Edgar Allan Poe, up until the end when there's a falling out, which I won't tell you, but I'm giving you the gist of it. There
Right.
is
But
something
you are,
that happened.
yeah, they were lifelong friends
They were lifelong friends. Poe's
and
best friend.
they best friends.
I would say best friends,
Yeah.
yes. Of course, when Poe was traveling, he wasn't seeing
Right.
John, but even when he was traveling, John was providing funds through
For Edgar, yeah.
Edgar's mother-in-law
Okay.
so that he was helping out even when they weren't seeing each other for years.
This is groundbreaking for Poe scholars.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think it'll be very exciting. And it's also, I think, very heartening to
Hmm.
know that Poe had this support, this close friend uh, who meant so much to him. And now we know about that. We knew about the friendship to some extent, but now
Right.
we know the friendship. We will know the friendship in great detail.
Wow. You're very stoic about talking about this, but I wanna rewind a little bit. You pulled out that first letter from this box that survived miraculously for you to get your hands on.
Yeah.
Bring me through the emotional state of discovering one letter, then 2, and what you're as a post scholar, you're learning new things.
Right, right.
So
I was
take me
anything.
through that.
I was anything but stoic. Um, once I realized I had a new story, and of course I had to check all the biographies to make sure this story wasn't in any
Sure,
of them.
yeah.
It wasn't. Uh, I was just wondering what is this? And so the next day I did another letter, and there was another story, and I checked the biographies, and it wasn't. And I realized I had a series of unknown stories about Edgar Allan Poe, which was amazing. And I would wake up each day, and I would think, what's Poe going to do today?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Like you're reading a book.
that's right, because it's unknown, but it's downstairs, and I'm going to find out by the end of the day some new thing that Edgar Allan Poe did.
Mhm.
And it was very thrilling. This was 2012. Now, it took a long time to transcribe everything.
Mhm.
Um, but that initial period where I was doing it day after day after day was tremendously exciting, energizing, thrilling, fabulous.
You must have
It's
been floating. You must have been
yeah,
floating.
it's just the sort of thing you think could never happen. And
And
here it
yeah.
is happening.
And how if you're allowed to say how many letters were in that box talking about Edgar?
Yeah, maybe there were 30 letters, but a point to make is a letter could be a page long,
Hmm?
or a letter could be 30 pages long. And as she wrote over time, this is 1908 going into 1909, she's she's telling her stories. Eventually, she's going to slow down.
Right.
For that period, particularly in 1908, she's going strong. She's been waiting to tell these stories to somebody, and she's got her man, um, which is very fortunate because they're in black and white and they're good forever.
Fountain pen?
Yeah, I imagine you're right. Yes, a fountain pen.
And,
Actually,
and
it's
yeah,
it's not just Poe. She also writes about herself. She
yeah,
writes about her
yeah.
family. She lived in a town called Danville, Virginia, which
Okay.
is an hour south of Richmond. So she talks about the town. Um, it's it's all interesting, but the
Right.
Poe stuff is the most interesting. And what
But
happened?
the lady that you bought the letters from, somewhere along the line, it had to be known that for you to buy them, for you to have contact with her, that Edgar Allan Poe has information in here. So some was that on the cover of the box? Was there what was the inkling for her to understand Edgar Allan Poe as this literary figure and I need to do something with this?
Well, she probably knew family stories. I mean, that's my guess.
Right.
I was told by a friend there's a woman who has some papers that have to do with Poe, but he didn't know what they were. I certainly didn't know what they were. And
A
my
great
guess,
friend. That's a great friend.
she just probably remembered what her mother had said, or grandmother. So that's my hunch
Right.
about that. And the thing that happened is, after I transcribed a number of these letters, I I talked to a fellow who's a very distinguished scholar of American literature, Joel Meyerson.
Okay.
He was a great transcendentalist scholar. And I said, Joel, who would be interested in a new book about Edgar Allan Poe? And he said in a split second, University of Virginia Press.
Hometown.
Which, oh, that's right. He lived in Charlottesville. He went to the University of Virginia. Makes total sense. And they've published fine books about Poe in the past. So in January 2016, I went to Austin, I think, Austin, Texas, for an MLA, Modern Language Association conference, where the publishers, the university presses, show their wares and are open to conversation. So I went to the Virginia Press booth, and I met the fellow who was there, an editor named Eric Brandt. He's now the director of the press.
Okay.
And I said, well, you know, Mr. Brandt, I have these materials. And I told him some of the stories I've just told you. This is a very brief conversation.
Mhm.
And I said, well, I can imagine editing the letters, or maybe I should use the letters as to inform a new biography of Edgar Allan Poe. And he
Right.
said, that's it.
A new biography. No.
and that was the beginning. I had a contract in a few months, and my deadline was March 1st, 2023, and I got it in about 2 weeks early.
Right.
And the last year has been devoted to revision and proofing and that sort of thing. And it'll come out in 6 weeks.
And 700 plus pages, Richard. I mean, you're not shedding light, you're shedding a sun.
Oh,
I
thank you. Thank you. I like that. Thank you.
Amazing.
It's about 500 pages of text and about 200 pages of notes.
Right.
And, since I have been working on Poe for my career, I can draw on a lot to supplement
Yeah.
the manuscript discoveries. And also, I did other research. I spent a semester at the Library of Congress. I spent a semester at the Library of Virginia.
And what were you looking for as you were doing this digging? What were you looking for parallels? What were
Well,
you looking for?
in one case, it was quite focused. The Library of Congress has the Ellis and Allen papers. Ellis was the partner of John Allen. Allen was John Allen, and they had an import-export business. And these papers are known, and there's even a microfilm reel of Poe-related stuff, but it's a vast collection that's not on microfilm. And so you have to look through book after book after book. And much of the information is about business. But every so often, it's narrative. Edgar is in there. Also, the business,
He's in there because of why?
because he's the stepson. Somebody
Okay.
says,
Okay.
could I have a suit for my son? He's the
Right.
same size as Edgar.
Right.
Oh my God.
So you're literally looking for, you're getting grains of sand
Right.
from this vast collection.
And that's right. And also, I learned a great deal about the business reverses of John Allen, which
Mm,
might well have made him even more difficult than he otherwise would have been, because his business shut down. There was a great panic in
right.
1819, and he was in debt, and he was in bad shape. So I culled information on Edgar and on his foster father, and the foster mother is mentioned too, Frances Allen, from those 3 months at the Library of Congress. And they were great months. And people around me were making their own discoveries. So although it's totally quiet, every so often you hear somebody say, "Oh my God, here we go." So it was a great space. This is the Madison building of the Library
Yeah.
of Congress, and it was wonderful.
But through this epistolary, these beautiful letters, you're watching Edgar grow up.
That's right. Watching him grow up.
You-
In the second case, the Library of Virginia, I had a broader array of resources because there wasn't one single thing like Ellis and Allen papers. So I had to make decisions about what I was going to look at. And I focused on the newspapers of Poe's time because the newspapers have probably more information than any other single resource, especially if you read a lot of them. And I know, of course, many newspapers are online, but many are not online. And so I was able to read newspapers that you couldn't otherwise read, except if you go to this library and request them day by day by day, week by week by week.
Right. So
And
what are you looking for reviews? What are you looking for through the newspapers?
well, this is early, so it's
Okay.
not
Okay.
going to be.
Very early. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, later on, of course, there would be
Yeah.
reviews. I'm focusing on Poe as a boy.
Okay.
So I'm looking for anything that
Any.
relates,
Sure.
anything that
Yeah.
relates. Maybe it's a play, maybe it's a review of a book that Poe might have seen, maybe
Right.
it's a lecture that he might have heard, maybe it's a poem that he might have written.
Microscopic digging is what you're doing.
Yes, yes. But if I find one great thing,
Yeah.
that's all I need.
And then 700 pages later,
Yeah, that's
you had it.
that's
For
right.
sure you had it.
That's right.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I want to go back to Boston and Poe.
Okay.
When did the dark days really start ascending on him, and why?
Um, I think, of course, he, his loss of his parents was a great grief.
Hmm.
He lost, he was separated from his brother, who was taken in by the grandparents in Baltimore. Um, the relationship with John Allen was critical, and that did not become terrible until the 1820s.
Okay.
Poe's 10, 12, 14,
Hmm.
and he's beginning to uh, feel his own independence. He's not a little boy anymore. And his foster father is becoming severe and threatening him and reminding him constantly that Edgar, is dependent on his charity. You are not my natural son.
Yeah.
You're not even my adopted son. I took you in out of the goodness of my heart. And so, what does Edgar say to this? And in addition, your mother's reputation is not what it
Right.
should. So Edgar is a kind of miserable kid.
How
And
how widespread was in the social context fostering kids back then?
I don't know enough to tell you, Max. I mean, it
Right.
happened.
Right.
I can't give you a percentage.
Right. But was it a hospital related thing, or was there even an organization that early?
Here's what happened. I'm talking about 1811.
Okay.
Edgar's mother, whose name was Eliza, is dying. It's known that she's dying. It's in the paper that she's
Hmm.
dying. She was a beloved actress, and people are visiting her. And her oldest son, whose name is Henry, has been taken by Henry's grandparents, but she's got two
Okay.
kids left with her, Edgar and this little baby, Rosalie. So two women, young women in their 20s, women of the, you would say the middle class, um, are doing an act of charity. Together, they will go visit this woman who is dying. They probably, who knows, might have even seen her in a performance. She was
Right.
very celebrated. And there she is. And I know this from the letters. She's very concerned, not because she's dying, what will happen to her children?
Sure.
So the two women are Jane Scott Mackenzie and Frances Allen. Now, Jane Scott Mackenzie at the time has a son and a daughter. The son is John H. Mackenzie, and the daughter is Martha. Frances Allen has no children. And in fact, she never will have any children, which was a great
Hmm.
pain to her. And so Jane Scott said, you take your choice.
Wow. God.
And Frances said, I want the boy. Because the boy was exciting and lively and sharp, even as a almost 3-year-old.
Hmm.
Whereas the girl, I mean, first of all, she's just a baby, but she was kind of dull, as she was her whole life.
Right.
So Jane Scott said, okay, Edgar is yours. Now, meanwhile, they were tending to the mother, but the mother was reassured because the women said, this is what will happen. Frances will take Edgar, and Jane Scott will take Rosalie. Your kids will be taken care of.
Mm.
So the woman, that is Eliza, could feel relief. Okay, it's going to be okay. And she could die with some degree of peace.
Oof. This story. This is a story.
Yeah.
2025. Is there any Edgar Allan Poe descendants now? I mean, is there a family tree that is continued?
Well, no direct descendants because Poe had no
Right.
children.
Right. But
But yes, there
yeah.
are descendants of corollary lines in the family. And there's even a fellow who wrote a book on Poe whose name is Harry Poe. I mean, and he looks like Poe.
Okay,
Uh,
okay.
a great guy. So yes, it's a long time, but there still are uh, descendants of cousins and so forth who are alive and well.
Hmm. Well, and with this large volume coming out, are there any missing years left? Is there anything that we don't know that still we're looking to discover?
Well, always. There are periods of his life that we know only very sparsely.
Mhm.
Um, the Richmond, I'm sorry, the Boston period in 1827. He spent some years in Baltimore, and I have some information, not as strong as I have for Richmond, but I have some information. But still, I'm sure there's a lot more to know about Baltimore in 28, 29, 31 through 35. Uh, it's murky, those years.
And what do you attribute the murkiness to? Not a literary sensation, or just lost in the alcoholism? Or what was it? What was it that
Well,
kept him
it,
so? Oh,
it's early on. He's not a famous person yet,
mhm,
so he's not getting the attention he will one day get.
right.
Um, he didn't know that many people. He's spending his time writing, trying to build his reputation. So he's not paid attention to. In the future, he's going to be the observed of all observers. But now he's he's this guy who's struggling. And he has a few close friends who've left us something, but there's a lot more that was going on that we just don't know.
And look at this. I mean, you and I are talking about him in 2025. I mean, what he would think. I think his vision came true.
Yes, he
Yeah.
thought he was for the ages, and he
Yeah.
is for the ages. So he thought he was for the world,
Yeah.
and he is for the world.
Amazing. Well, I thank you for weaving this beautiful and eloquent story. As soon as you talked about that box, you started to glow in this interview. It was
Well,
wonderful.
thank you for animating me
I
by
hope you're going to
asking
float
the
for
right
a few
questions.
more hours. Yeah, you're going to
Sure, sure.
float for a few more hours. I thank you, and I look forward to the book coming out in a couple weeks, probably now, or probably what,
6 weeks.
6 weeks. Yeah, 6 weeks it'll be coming out. And thank you for just weaving this great tale for us, and for anyone interested in Edgar Allan Poe. So this leads me to the last question that I ask everybody who appears on this show. You are Destination Unknown 24. Where will you be sending me for episode number 25?
Paul Lewis,
Paul.
Lewis. Paul
Okay.
Lewis is retired professor of English from Boston College,
Oh, wonderful.
and he has his own Poe book that he's working on, and
Okay.
he'll be glad to talk with you.
Well, as a former Mount Ida College alumni, it would be nice to go back to Chestnut Hill and spend some time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You'll have a great time with
All
him.
right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this enlightening and enthralling conversation. You got me thinking, Poe, right now. I'm floating a little bit on your story, and so I hope that lasts for a little while.
Great. Thank you for inviting me.
We will talk soon. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye, Max.